just taking the time to learn from experts. So as someone who teaches climate change at both the honors biology level and at the AP environmental science level, I have realized how overwhelming it can be with all that information that's out there as to like, what am I going to choose into my curriculum and lessons? Who am I going to highlight? I've also struggled with having my students care about that topic, especially when a lot of the news that we see may not directly impact them, especially here in the Midwest. So this type of panel is extremely important because we get to draw from the experiences that we're hearing from our experts to bring into our classroom and find ways to connect with these experts. It is our duty as educators to constantly learn what our community is doing. And then it's also the role of our experts to be reaching out to us as educators to bring in that knowledge as well. So this type of bridging events are so, so important. One thing I've noticed when I've talked to educators here in Chicago is that there's a lot of uncertainty between the term weather and climate. And so we hear our leaders reference about the weather and they relate it to, well, is climate change happening? Is global warming happening? And so I think just to start off with that foundation is going to be pretty critical, and just a nice reminder to anyone who's listening is that our weather is our day-to-day atmospheric changes, or rarely on that short term that we see, versus climate change. Scientists are getting that average of those atmospheric conditions, whether it's like average temperature, precipitation, over a 30-year period. So it takes a lot of time and a lot of work to get this data. And so when I collaborate with amazing scientists across the nation who are climate scientists, they have dedicated their entire life gathering this data. And to see that data being dismissed hurts me as well, because their life's work is being dismissed. And so I think we have to be very clear about the comments that we see in the public world about the weather change versus climate change. So that's something I just want to start off with. The second thing I want to bring up is that what's really important is when we think about where we get these resources from is to really look at the organizations that have been doing the work to gather all this global climate change data. So I think of the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration that's been doing a great job gathering that work and just displaying it to the public. And they will make it clear now to use language by, instead of just saying climate change, they will say human-induced climate change. And I think that change in language is so important because it shows to us that we have contributed to this phenomena, and it is our responsibility to also respond to the things that we're seeing. And I don't want to go too much into climate change because I know the experts in this space are going to be sharing a lot more, and their examples are going to be absolutely critical. So I'm going to introduce our amazing guests today. I'll introduce all four guests, and then I'll start off with our first question and have each one of them go ahead and share their response to that question. So our first guest is our Illinois state biologist. So Dr. Eric Shawver is the director of the Illinois Natural History Survey and the Illinois State Biologist. He's an ecologist whose research ranges from wildlife behavior to Lyme disease to plant reproduction. A native of the Northeast, he studied at UMass Amherst, Oregon State University, and the University of Connecticut before moving to Illinois in 2002. Our second guest is from the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus. So Edith Makra directs the sustainability initiatives for the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus, a coalition of 275 mayors in the greater Chicago region. She leads programs to advance sustainability and environmental stewardship for municipalities. Makra developed the Greenest Region Compact, a consensus sustainability pledge now adopted by 141 Chicago area communities, forming the largest regional municipal sustainability collaborative in the US. She has led the creation of the first climate action plan for the Chicago region. She has a BS in forestry from the University of Illinois, an executive sustainability certificate from Harvard University, and is an International Society of Sustainability Professionals Sustainability Excellence Professional. Our third guest is from the University of Illinois, Chicago. So we have Elena Grossman, is a research specialist at the University of Illinois at Chicago School of Public Health. In this role, she coordinates the Region 5 Pediatric Environmental Health Service Units, environmental justice, and PFAS work by making environmental health educational opportunities available for healthcare providers and communities. She is also creating a concentration in climate change, sustainability, and health for the UIC School of Public Health. She also served as the program director for the Building Resilience Against Climate Effects in Illinois Brace Illinois project, which was a partnership between the University of Illinois at Chicago School of Public Health and the Illinois Department of Public Health to help prepare Illinois for the health effects from climate change. So thank you all three for being here. And our fourth guest is our Illinois State climatologist. So Dr. Trent Ford, who has been the Illinois State climatologist since 2019. He and his team provided information online through traditional and social media, and by speaking to interested groups across the state. In addition to his role in education and climate outreach, Ford also conducts research on the climate system and extreme climate events like drought and heat waves, monitors current conditions, and studies climate change. A native of Roanoke, Illinois, Ford earned a bachelor's in geography from Illinois State University before completing his master's and PhD at Texas A&M University. So thank you to our amazing guests who are here, and I'm so excited to have you all respond to these questions. So my first question, and I like to start off with anyone jumping in, and then it's just free flow. We'll see who wants to just jump in and answer, but ideally we'd like to have everyone share. And then folks in the audience, if you have a question, if you would like to follow up on anything that's being said, feel free to add in the chat. We will have some time at the end for you guys for me to read those questions out loud. So our first question, how does your research and work contribute to the body of knowledge around climate change? What brought you to this important topic?
I'll go first, then I'll jump in here and be short. I come at climate change from a climate science background, and I will say that 20 years ago, the term climate change, or probably global warming, used more often then, was really something that was studied primarily by climate scientists, because at that time it was documenting the change and trying to convince folks that it was actually happening, and trying to understand some of the kind of more straightforward impacts, like changes in hurricane intensity or frequency. And that's really my background, is understanding, measuring the weather and the climate, understanding climate, and trying to understand the kind of physical changes in our climate system, like changes in extreme rainfall, changes in heat, things like that. And really over the last 20 years, the term climate and climate science even has expanded well beyond understanding the physical climate system, and that's really in response to the comprehensive, the overarching impacts of climate change, as well as the necessary strategies and solutions it takes. So although I come from climate change from a physical climate science background, a lot of the work I do now is collaborative, bringing that expertise into work with folks like Eric and Elena and Edith to use that information and their expertise to actually make solutions, or to better understand what kind of impacts are happening to make climate change a little bit more or a lot more salient for folks, as you were mentioning, Aisha, folks who may not know how it impacts them.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. And then anyone else wants to jump in?
I'll jump in, hoping we'll go back to the scientists on research. But again, I'm Edith Macra, and I'm the environment director for the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus. And I'm work in public policy, so I am not a scientist. And Aisha, it was really interesting to hear your introduction to, trying to, for educators grasping for information and then trying to share that. The group that I work with, which is local elected officials or mayors, is not unlike that, that where they're not focused specifically on environment, they are focused on the well-being of their communities. And I like to say 275 communities. One of them is Chicago and the rest are not. So most of these civic leaders represent small communities, and they are usually volunteers or a very small stipend, grew up in the community, care deeply about the residents, care deeply about making small changes or making changes in their community that leave a legacy and make their place better. And my work in climate change was working to try to use the talent, the knowledge, the passion that these local leaders have, and the authorities. I'll wait for the question further down in terms of what gives you hope, but local governments have authorities to address climate change in a very unique way. And so the work that I have done with the Climate Action Plan, it took the climate science and studied other policies by other organizations, cities, regions around the world, really, to look at action. So that's the work that I've been doing. And the knowledge that I have on climate change really comes from the esteemed scientists on the rest of the panel.
And the work that you're doing is absolutely important because it's applying that. And it's like, how do we shape these policies that shape the curriculum that I am bound to teach for that year? So that trickle down. So yeah, thank you for sharing that perspective. And then Dr. Schauber, how did you get into this really important work?
Sure. Well, as a wildlife biologist, you can't not be aware of the fact that the temperature and the rainfall patterns in any given place really determine what kind of plants and animals you're going to see there, and they respond to the changes in those variables over the course of the year. And so, just going 100 miles, you can see an abrupt shift in what kind of species you find there, the communities you find. And that really drives home the sensitivity of biological systems to the conditions that shape their environment. Specifically, my own path has been a really winding path. Like I said, I've gotten involved in a lot of different things, but one of the bits of research I've done was looking at mice and how important they are. So mice that eat gypsy moths and keep the forest from being defoliated. But the same mice also give ticks Lyme disease bacteria, and then they can transmit it to us. And then the mouse populations go up and down from year to year based on how many acorns the trees produce. And it seems like in certain years, all the trees have got the same signal. They understand the assignment, and they all produce lots of nuts in the same year. And then the next year, maybe they produce hardly any at all. And this is a phenomenon called masting. And you can see the mouse populations. When we count the acorns on the ground, we can know whether we're going to have lots of mice the next year or not. It's one of the, a lot of times we have a really struggle with predicting things. This is something we can really predict, and it's something that affects people. So how do the trees do it? How do they know that this is the year that we're going to produce lots of nuts together? So I got working with some scientists in New Zealand who have been studying this phenomenon. The phenomenon is called masting, the sort of boom and bust cycle of seeding. And they had this long-term data set from a bunch of different kinds of plants in New Zealand where grasses, lilies, nut-producing trees were all ganging up together and producing lots of seeds in the same years, and then having off years in the same years and stuff. And so we, explored different hypotheses and basically came up with what seems to be a cue that these plants are cueing in on, where if it's warmer than average in the summer, the plants produce more flower buds. And so they'll produce more seeds the next year. If it's cooler than average in the summer, the plants will produce more vegetative buds. And so this sort of cue helps them to get on the same page, which obviously leads into the question of what happens when it's warmer than average all the time. And it's this on-off cycle that helps the plants reproduce by, in the off years, basically they're starving the animals that eat their seeds. And then the next year they come around with all the resources they've saved up in that year, and then swamp them with a huge amount of seeds. And by doing this boom and bust cycle, they have a much higher success rate than if they just produce the same number of seeds every year. Well, so that question of how these plants are going to respond when it's warmer than average all the time is something that's really gotten me interested in it more specifically. And it's everything from the physiological level of how this trigger happens to, to what degree these plants can adapt, or do we need to have evolutionary change going on? Another thing that really got me into this was when I moved to New York, or not New York, to Illinois in 2002. And I started at Southern Illinois University. And Southern Illinois is like sort of the northern zone of a whole lot of species that are southeastern species. And one of those, for example, is the swamp rabbit, which sounds like it ought to be a mythological creature, but is real. And it's present in like Georgia and Florida, and it reaches the northern edge of its range in Southern Illinois. And I was involved in a bunch of studies there with that species. And what we found is that snowfall events they cause these spikes in mortality of the rabbits. The rabbits really have a hard time when there is snow, and that is sort of helps us to understand why they haven't gotten any further north. But as Trent will confirm, one of the big things we're seeing with climate change is that summer temperatures are moving a little bit, but winter temperatures are moving a lot, and we're seeing a lot more warming in the winter. And so that we expect that to shift some of these southeastern species to allow them to spread. And some of that is going to be good. Like, I'd like to see swamp rabbits around. They're cool, they're big, they're about twice as big as a cottontail. They jump in the water when they're scared and they swim away. They're really cool. There's other things like prothonotary warblers that are doing better as the climate is warming. And then other things that are kind of neutral or just interesting, like armadillos. We're starting to see them moving into the state more. Green tree frogs are moving into the state more. But it's also going to be a concern because some species that are now at their southern edge of their range are probably going to be shifting out of the state. And at least 80% of the rare plants in Illinois are vulnerable to climate change. And then we have things like kudzu that is already starting to make inroads into Southern Illinois, and Gulf Coast ticks that are moving up into Central Illinois and carrying pathogens with them. So just being in a really tall north to south state really drives home the fact that we're on the edge of the range of a lot of species. So some will be moving in and some will be moving out as the climate shifts.
And these beautiful, rich examples reminds me of a concept that I try to incorporate into curriculum, which is this phenotypic mismatch that we see. And so we teach students all these different cycles in science, but then it's like, but so what? And then this is where you can bring climate change into that picture. And so it's, for example, anyone on this call who's working with educators, or you're an educator yourself, I think of this great new documentary that came out from PBS surrounding this one photographer who's capturing the bees in his garden. And then there's a line that he brings up about the bees' timing of like coming out from their little homes are tied to the flowers blooming, and just that simple concept to tie into, well, when are the flowers blooming? And what if that blooming event happened a little too soon? And by the time the bees come out, they don't have that supply to capture that pollen. So I think that there's very simple examples of how we can have students engage in these very complex ideas through some of the stuff that we're already teaching. We just have to connect everything together. And then I have here also, Elena, how did you get into this really important work?
Yeah, when you mentioned connecting everything together, that's kind of how I fit in. And I find myself kind of in between Dr. Sharburn, Ford, and Edith, where I've been doing a lot of practice-oriented work, like public health practice, with some research that informs practice. So there are so many different health effects from climate change, and I've found that a lot of my work is connecting the dots. None of the health effects are new. They're just being exacerbated and an increased risk. And, really connecting the dots for public health professionals, for physicians, for students, urban planners. A lot of the strategies that will really protect our health don't fall in public health jurisdiction, right? Like we're not engineers, we're not urban planners, we're not landscapers, but all of those skills can have huge benefits on our health and protecting our health and building resilience against climate change. We can provide a lot of the data around health. And, I'll often say that, we're trying to shift the conversation, nothing against flora and fauna, but oftentimes people care more about themselves and their own health. So, shifting the conversation away from, I used to ask this question to local health departments, what are the first things you think of when you hear climate change? Polar bears, glaciers, and Al Gore were often the three things that would always come up. And there's obviously more to it than that. So really trying to shift that conversation. I found myself, I lived in Guatemala for a while working with subsistence farmers. And then I lived in Florida for a while working with migrant farm workers. Similar work on different sides of the border. And a lot of the time I was thinking of how their physical health really impacts their ability to survive and make a living. And then, I was thinking further about how the environment's health impacts their ability to eat and make a living. We've started to see these shifts. There have been stories about Central Americans migrating because they haven't been able to produce the amount of food that they need for the time period in between growing seasons. And then here with farm workers trying to, they're obviously very dependent on the environment's health as well and its ability to produce the crops that they are picking. So that kind of got me interested in this work as I ventured into public health. Thinking I've done work with both Trent and Edith. And as I was listening to, Dr. Sharber talk about the armadillos, and while it is hard to actually get leprosy from armadillos, they do transmit it. And so like there are all of these small and big impacts that climate change has on our health. And, we're really trying to bring to light these impacts and that they're aware of it. And, looking at how, for example, looking at temperature data and heat hospitalizations, temperature data and asthma hospitalizations, precipitation data and gastrointestinal hospitalizations or cases, even thinking about temperature and mental health hospitalizations and or prescriptions, really connecting climate change, weather. Obviously there's a difference, but you can look at trends over a long period of time, looking at health data and weather climate data to see how it's being impacted. On the flip side, you could potentially even look at health data and transition to alternative energy sources. And are we seeing change? Obviously, that's a longitudinal a study, but I think it's an important study. I mean, to really understand if there's a change in health effects, these are longitudinal studies to see those changes. And we've done work with local health departments, we've done work with the state health department, and it's at the local level that you can really, as Edith was saying, that you can really make these changes and you can make the changes faster.
And I think it's excellent that you've been asking your students what they think when they think of climate change. I do a very similar question, but this time it's tied to if students think we're part of nature or not, if they think humans are part of nature or not. And this is all thanks to this was a environmental psychology class that I took here, and thanks to that professor who got me into thinking of just the psychology of the environment and then our relationship to the environment, how separate we tend to be and how like directly we feel it. And it's just like that separation. I find that so fascinating. And those simple questions are great questions for young people or even educators to kind of reflect and think about is like, where are you on scale of connectedness to nature? And how do you react to the natural world? And as an educator who, you know, when I started this journey, and I mentioned this earlier too, it was so overwhelming to see all this data. So my background coming from a biological background, micro perspective, going to macro, taking simple ecology classes, or it just looking at all this data and struggling to choose what to add to your curriculum. That was tough, especially when our standards do not really capture really well what climate change education looks like. A lot of that started to develop recently. So this leads to my second question. For educators who are just starting this journey, and they feel pretty overwhelmed by what's available on the internet, all the experts that are available to like reach out to, what would your advice be to educators who are starting this? Where should they go? What should they look into? Edith, do you want to start us off?
I was muted. And I don't, I educate mayors is what I do. So I don't have resources for teachers, but I think the one thing that I can contribute, and I'll put it in the chat, is that our climate action plan took a lot of data about the risks in the region and the greenhouse gas emissions. We used a regional greenhouse gas inventory. And what I think it can do, looking at our plan, will help understand priority actions, where the impacts are, and just a little learning that we did. So greenhouse gas inventory, just to make sure everybody knows what that's about, there is emissions from all sources of fossil fuels and different ways of measuring how sort of far out that circle of influence goes. But looking at the very core of using energy data, both electrical energy, attaching an emissions factor to it, and then looking at models that predict or estimate transportation energy. That, looking at that specifically, tells us that there are some really important things that we can do as individuals and as communities that will influence that. And again, the learning that I did when I worked on this, because I'm an environment director, and what it told us is that initiatives that take, for example, the recycling and composting and plastics issues. These are really important environmental issues, really important environmental issues. Their impacts on reducing the emissions related to climate change are very small. And so I think that, the climate action plan will at least help to understand where priority actions are if your desire is to impact climate change. And just because Elena's on the call, and I also have to address adaptation, we also looked at strategies for adapting to the impacts of climate change, which are the primary ones are extreme heat and flooding, with also drought in there. And the kinds of things that can be done, again, at a local level or even at a household level, are really thoughtful and kind of eye-opening. And the one that I like best out of my whole adaptation portion of the plan is kind of self-preparation. And you hear that. So if we all know that the weather will be extreme, but can you do things to prepare for that protect yourself? That might be to manage the heat, is do your very best to cool your home, and to think about, maybe even before you take down a tree, think about, where's that shade coming from, or should you be planting one? Or even in terms of flooding preparation, that says, if your neighbor's basement flooded, you might not want to put really valuable things on the floor, or lift your appliances up a couple of inches off the floor. That's the kind of self-preparation, and that's climate adaptation that builds resilience. So that's what I think I can offer up for resources, and I'll put that link in the chat.
That's wonderful. And I even think about literacy, environmental literacy, having students read a report, see that real application of the stuff they're learning. All and that climate action report's super interdisciplinary. So they can see not only can they do the math for the energy that they're saving, but they're also seeing that sustainability aspect of it too. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. How about you, Dr. Schalber? What would you recommend to teachers?
Sure. So a bunch of our scientists here at the Natural History Survey, as well as Trent and some other folks with the Water Survey, recently were involved in a big climate assessment with the Nature Conservancy. And that, I think it does a really good job of just compiling a lot of what we know about what has changed, what we're likely to see in the future, and then the ramifications of that for things like infrastructure and biological systems and human health and vector-borne disease, mosquitoes and ticks and things like that. So I think that did a good job of summarizing some of that in a very credible, the experts themselves were involved across this. So that was a good one. So I've put that out there as a really good resource.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And when I get a chance, I'll probably link what you just referenced as well into chat for anyone who's interested. So thank you. And how about you, Dr. Ford?
Yeah, it is overwhelming. I'm just going to put that out there that even if you want to focus on one aspect of climate change, which by the way, you could teach the entire K through 12 every year on a different aspect of climate change for all 8 hours of school and still not cover everything. So it does help to focus a little bit. If you want to cover the fundamentals of climate and how it changes, if you want to focus on health impacts, if you want to focus on natural ecosystem impacts, water resources impacts, impacts to Chicago specifically, impacts in Northeast Illinois, impacts to the Great Lakes, or solutions and adaptation. I really like what Edith mentioned too, because it really helps. The information they have in the climate action plan really helps understand that there are lots of solutions for mitigation adaptation, and some are maybe a bit more effective than others. And some are more doable than others. One tool that I can't really sing the praises of enough, as I just put the link in there, is the Illinois Indiana Sea Grant Weather and Climate Explorer. It's geared towards, nodding your head, it's geared towards the towards K through 12 educators. I have gone through, I can't say that every single source is a good one in there, but I haven't found a bad one yet. And that is a great place to start, I would say, because you can sort by the grade level. There's a lot of ways to sort by the kind of topic, as I was mentioning, to specify what you're looking for. And it can send you down the rabbit hole in a good way. Right. The rabbit hole in a bad way is just searching climate change, finding a website that looks like it's okay and not actually being okay. The good rabbit hole is that you go to this website and then you find that it has another tool on that website that's even cooler, has even more application. And so that is a really good resource for just starting out what resources are available for climate change. One on the more negative side, if you get sent something from directly through the mail, through email, from a source that is not federal or state government certified, I would be skeptical about those resources. And the reason I say that is because there are groups who do send educators directly materials. Those materials contain very bad science or not science in many ways. And what they're meant to do is prey on the lack of time and resources that you all have as educators, hoping that you'll just teach it because it's in a really good format. Unfortunately, those resources are well funded, much better than I'm funded. So I can't fight fire with fire, but I will say the lack of money that I have, I'm always happy to make up in time. So if there, is going through those resources, the ones that Eric mentioned with the Illinois Climate Assessment, it's a great first level especially, and it's not written to scientists. It's written to non-scientists. But if you are looking at resources, you find something that looks interesting, but you're not sure about it. My information, my contact information is all over the website, State Climatologists of Illinois. And if you email me a resource to ask if it is legitimate or if there's a specific thing, I will respond, typically within just a couple of hours. I usually get maybe 1 or 2 emails a month from educators with that. And if I got 5 or 10 times that, it would be wonderful. So that is one thing as well that if you are going through those steps of, there's so much information, so many resources available. And this is why, as Abby mentioned, these kind of connections are so important, or Aisha, you mentioned the connections are so important, that reaching out to us as experts is something, at least for me, I don't want to volunteer anybody else, is something that is really great. And so I just want to mention that as well.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I'm glad you brought up Illinois Sea Grant. I know from experience, they offer even stipends to teachers to check out a lesson. When I first started teaching, I remember it was just like it was like $250 for classroom materials. And that's a lot as a starting teacher. So if you have not checked that out, I definitely recommend checking them out. Some of these orgs do have those resources. And then Elena, what advice would you give to teachers who are just starting this journey?
Yeah, so I can share a report that we produce, a climate and health profile report. It's actually designed for it might even be more designed for like elementary level. 6th grade reading level was our goal. But I think we tried to keep it as short and concise as possible. So it's actually very doable as an assignment, maybe even high school, I'm not sure, not a teacher. But I'll put that there. It provides, I like to think of it as our problem statement. So it goes through, what are the climate threats to Illinois? Who is at the biggest risk? And then what are the actual health concerns? It doesn't go into, what to do about it. So this is more of like the problem statement. CDC, also I'm going to share this too. CDC, their climate and health program, created videos, which I think could also be like a good tool for teachers. Like they're not long, I think they're animated. They do a good description on big picture climate and health, and then goes into different health effects. And then, something that I think is really important in terms of connecting students is trying to localize it as much as possible. It's good for adults too, right? We can connect to it better. I always think of, the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization here in Chicago did like a citizen science project with like an AP statistics course in one of the local high schools. And they counted the diesel buses that went by their high school and then did a bunch of statistical analyses, so it's like, has like an educational component. And I think like those types of projects are really great. Obviously, maybe there's more work put on the teacher in doing that. But I think like citizen science projects like that are great. There's also the Air Quality Index, which is through airnow.gov. They have a flag program. It could be a great opportunity for a school to, maybe students could advocate for the school to do it. And you essentially are following the air quality, and then you could incorporate that into curriculum. So like you're actually doing something, you're checking out every day, what is it? And then you could maybe even track how infrequently are you having good health, a good air quality, poor air quality, whatever it may be. That's also something I think that I'll look for that. That could also be like a good resource for teachers.
And I appreciate you sharing that report too. I actually saved both reports. As an AP Environmental Science teacher, I have my students read published scientific literature. So as challenging as it is, it's kind of fun to find research that's probably 4 to 5 pages long, which is tough, but it exists. And we will unpack that together, go through challenging vocabulary together. But these reports are important too, because they get to see the actual work that's being done. It's And I've noticed from the feedback I've gotten from students is that this work is hopeful to them. When they see people putting this time and effort, they come out feeling like there is work being done. And what's also neat is these reports sometimes are read by their parents. So when I meet them during parent-teacher conferences, I'll have a parent or two who'll share like, you shared this one reading or this one report from Chicago. I ended up reading that. That was pretty cool. So I think it's cool to bring pieces of literature, or just meaningful to bring pieces of literature of stuff that is being worked upon and just worked on and implemented. That stuff is so important. The next question that I feel like with this current environment, this question is one that I feel at times, speaking to colleagues across the nation and even here in Chicago, is I'm noticing a tension around using the word climate change. It comes really charged at times. And so how do you encourage teachers who are hesitant to bring up climate change? How would you encourage them to be like, yes, you should talk about this? What would your advice be on that?
I'll take that one first because I feel very strongly about that. There is urgency to climate action. And I don't want to say there's no time to be polite or fearful, but we are very short on time for action. And I think if educators can, thank you for the thumbs up, there's just no time for hesitancy. And I will share a little story with my own journey into climate action. I represent 275 communities, as I said, and not all of them are very progressive. And they can be a conservative bunch, and we're a politically diverse area, although not as diverse as if we were statewide, but nonetheless. So had the background in sustainability. And in 2017, as the US at the federal level pulled out of the Paris Agreement, and there was increasing calls for local government action, because this is one area where there's still going to be something that could be done. And it got to be an all hands on deck. It wasn't just local government, but that's what I was responding to. Companies, individuals, you know, we've got to turn this around. And I took this to my executive board, and I was slow played, you know, with this, was careful with the term climate change. Not everyone's going to embrace that. Let's take this to our full executive board and make sure that we can talk about it. And I played along. It was a delay of 4 or 5 months to do that. And I had a mayors only workshop, thinking if there are going to be, and I had climate scientists attend. We had guests from Argonne. We had meteorologist Tom Skilling and a few other trusted voices, a room full of only elected officials. And they could say, I don't believe in climate change. They could say whatever they wanted to, and they were safe. So we could have this conversation. We did. Nobody raised their hand and said, I don't think we should talk about this, or I don't think climate change is real. And there was no approval, no disapproval. We just went full steam ahead. And now we have one of only 3 regional climate action plans in the US. So I'd like to believe that you can be surprised with the degree of response. Thank you again for those emojis.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. It's amazing that you are in these positions to provide spaces for folks to unpack. And I think that's so important. How about you, Elena?
So I'm gonna kind of agree with Edith. You know, I've actually, when I've been interviewed by any sort of media person, whatever source of media, and they'll often say, you know, what can the media do? And I will say, stop asking the question if it's happening, because that's established. The political question is, what are we going to do about it? And that is totally fair, because that's what politics is, right? It's, you have a problem and let's debate what we're going to do about it. And so, you know, start posing that question. So what can we do about it? And that's okay. You can have different opinions as to what we're going to do about it, but it's established and it's happening. And I think, you know, my experience, because I know Trent also has some experience in this too. You know, I've traveled all across the state in different political environments. And I have run into occasions where there have been questions like, nope, I don't agree with this. And the way that I've managed that is that, okay, well, let's agree that we want to protect our community. And so then we'll take it from that angle. Now that's more from the adaptation angle, right? As opposed to mitigation. But then I have built relationships where I can then have real conversations. And sometimes we never get to the place of agreement, but sometimes you do, and you become more trusted because you're actually listening. There's listening that's happening on both sides. So, I think the angle is, how are we going to solve the problem? And this is the problem, and it's established. So I also, building relationships. I think that's, and listening, right? We have a hard time listening. It's hard to sometimes listen to an argument that's not rooted in science, but I think it's important to at least listen and try to establish that relationship. I know that there's, I don't think it was Yale. George Mason, I think, produced a paper on like the like 7 or 6 minds of climate change. And basically it's a spectrum, right? And you have on one end, like, we're all going to die because it's going to kill us all. And the other end is, this is a bunch of BS. And then there's everybody in between. And they'll say the majority of people are in between. And so there is room to have conversations instead of focusing on the two extremes, that we're actually in the middle. And that's important to remember when there is concern about bringing it up. You're going to have, there will be more people that are going to listen. They might be skeptical, but they're not going to shut you down immediately.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And then how about you, Trent?
Yeah, I don't want to repeat the great things that Elena and Edith said. I don't have a solid, this is absolutely what I do all the time, because I go back and forth. We can't really fight a problem unless we name it, but at the same time, it really depends on the purpose of the call. So for example, for hazard mitigation planning, you go into communities and talk about the hazards they're experiencing. If we come in and say, this is how climate change is affecting you, it really probably won't resonate. They'll be like, okay, let's get on with what we need to do to get FEMA money. But if you say, oh, here's the park that has flooded, once in the last 70 years, and it's flooded 5 times in the last 10 years. They'll be like, yeah, it has been flooding a lot. Yeah, it has. Well, look at this, precipitation's changing, right? And nodding heads, right? And so, the thing is that there is urgency. And as Elena mentioned, we have this majority of people who fall somewhere in between, but actually those Yale studies show that the majority are actually concerned about climate change, not alarmist. They're not dismissive. And unfortunately, what gets a lot of publicity is the extremes. I only have gotten pushback on mentioning climate change a handful of times out of giving hundreds of talks around the state. People listen, people accept that that's the way it is. I think the bigger issue, and I'll address more specifically the educator problem here in a second, but the bigger issue is not convincing people that it's real, but convincing people that they need to get above the day-to-day activity that it consumes them to actually do something about it, or to push people who represent them to do something about it. That's a lot harder. How we tell people that they need to get beyond the fact that their mortgage is due and their kids are doing this and everything that's going on, to worry about something that they may not be able to see actually impacts them directly. That's a really hard argument to make, whether or not they're politically motivated. When it comes to educators, if there are educators who are who are hesitant to mention climate change because they're afraid of political pushback, I think that I would argue that it is the ultimate service to the students to teach them about what's going to be the pressing issues in the world and the pressing issues that they're going to face, just like any current event, right? And so of course, educators, you are at the front lines of politics these days, and it can be troublesome, but for the service of the students, it's really important. Now, for the educators who are skeptical because they themselves don't know if they believe it, I would just argue that, or I would just say that you should go with an open mind into these materials that we're talking about. The climate assessments that Eric mentioned, the tool that I mentioned from Sea Grant, Edith's regional action plan, Elena's document about health impacts. Read about the impacts of climate change and the scientists who do this work, and then decide, of course, for yourself if this is something that you want to bring into the classroom or not. Ultimately, it's the educator's decision, but weighing in on something as important as climate change, based off of what we see by the tangential coverage it gets in the media, the 5-minute stories and things, is not sufficient. Reading through those materials is really important.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And then how about you, Eric? What would you say to that hesitant teacher?
Sure. The Edith and Elena's and Trent's comments were fantastic. I want to just hang on to something that Trent mentioned a little while ago, which is that there is a intentional, well-funded effort to muddy the water around this issue, and not teaching it just sort of leaves that I think a vacuum there that makes it's not a neutral thing in this environment. And so I think it's really important, as Trent said, to make sure that kids are aware of what is happening in the world. Just like there is a war going on in Ukraine, global temperatures are rising. These are things that are true. And the existence of that, although politicized, is not inherently political. And as Elena mentioned, it's the what do we do about it that's political, but that's where we can have some great debate. But it's really interesting just how, I don't know, recent the strong politicization has happened. That there was a commercial made by Newt Gingrich and Nancy Pelosi not that many years ago, where they both talked about how important it was to fight climate change. And just the polarization has happened since then. But this is not, something that fundamentally had to happen. That this isn't, an inherently liberal or democratic position. It's that there's sides that have been taken on it. So, I wholeheartedly agree with Trent that it's important that the existence of it is not political, and that it's a fact of the world we live in that we're not going to be able to do much about or protect ourselves going forward unless we acknowledge.
And I was just going to add on to that and say, my students, we all checked out the recent documentary Youth versus the Government. So the court case of Juliana versus the United States. So you have the 21 young plaintiffs that are sued our government for lack of climate action since 2015. And so when we think of Greta's action in, let's say, 2018, Autumn Pelter's action with the prime minister bringing up what was going on in Canada in 2016, it's interesting to see that young people have been talking about this for a very long time. And so to kind of piggyback what you were saying, this recent feeling, and then that documentary does a great job capturing that our government knew this was going on since the 50s. And there's a ton of reports and data out there, but have we done that action then or now? That's something we are trying to push for, because we're seeing that impact right now.
Hey,
And
Aisha.
yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry, go
Go
ahead.
ahead. Yeah.
Do you mind if I interject real quick?
Yeah.
One thing I forgot to mention. We're really talking here about folks who, thinking about climate change is either, yes, I believe it's real, it's a problem, or it's an absolute hoax. And I think that is a real problem, as Eric mentioned, the well-funded machine to try to muddy the water. On the other hand, when educators do talk about climate change, present climate change, it is very important not to over dramatize or over exaggerate the impacts it has on our daily lives. And that's especially the case for mental health for youth. We have this whole burgeoning subfield of psychology is climate anxiety, because 12, 13, 14-year-olds don't think they're going to see age 50 or don't believe their peers will. So that is something also is really important, and it can be challenging to sift through these reports and keep an optimistic face, but also, present that it is a serious problem with large consequences, but it's not a life ender. It's right. So these are the kind of things, the balance that it's played. So that's just one thing I wanted to mention. I forgot to.
And I really appreciate you sharing this, because as someone who teaches this, it's heavy. And so ways that I make it light, for example, today I had my students, we did a tree inventory of our campus. So what are some direct actions we can do is can get a consensus of the trees that we have here and protect them, try to get that tree campus, K through 12 recognition. So this is something I have to navigate, and I really appreciate bringing this up, because climate anxiety, not only for the educator, but also for our students. So balancing activities and actions, showing them hope, showing them recent stuff that's happening, and getting that feedback is really important. So hearing from my students what they want to do and what they want to learn, and honoring that. And when we think about climate action and we think about who climate change impacts, I'm also thinking about our marginalized communities. They tend to face an overwhelmingly amount of burden. How do you educate the public about the various inequalities communities face in your field of work? And this is for anyone to jump in.
I'll take a first stab at it. So at this point, there are so many tools. There are heat index vulnerability maps, there are flood index maps, there are air quality, both local, regional, national, different states have them. There are different indicators to measure it, and they're all really helpful. And I'm happy to share all of them. I mean, I think it's really important. I think what we're missing is, using those maps and now investing in those communities, because that's what we have to do. What I also like to do, so I'm happy to share those. The Nature Conservancy has some, looking at air quality, heat, and flooding. CMAP has one looking at flood. I know they're working on heat. I also like to use the 95 Chicago heat wave as an example. And so there are maps from that time period looking at, generally speaking, maps are very helpful, but looking at, at the neighborhood level, which neighborhood had the highest fatality rates. And then they have maps looking at crime during that time period and income. And so, you can see these neighborhoods light up. And then I'll add present day maps, including health maps. So, where are asthma hospitalizations, and it's the same neighborhoods. And you can also look at flood susceptibility. There was a great map produced with the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. I think it was the Urban Flood Act of, I can't remember exactly, but it was in 2015, and it shows it's looking at income, household, I think it's like median income, household income, and flood claims. And you can see the relationship, but they're all, it's all the same neighborhoods. You can look at air pollution. There's a lot of research that has been done to show the inequalities and how certain communities are more susceptible, or have experienced, they experience more air pollution, they experience higher temperatures even. So I think maps have been a really great tool in educating. We work with a variety of audiences, ranging from like like sixth graders all the way through to professionals. And I think that, kind of showing those overlaid, they're actually not even overlaid maps, but maps that highlight the same communities and its communities, low income communities and communities of color. And so you can really see it when you look at all these different indicators, they're not always even related. And I think that really highlights the inequalities that certain communities are facing.
And I also want to stress the maps. For me, that's how I engage where my students lie on the spectrum of how they feel about certain issues of inequality. So I'll give them the different wards of Chicago, income, just pure stats, and have them kind of draw out connections on their own. So I don't even have to show it to them. They can build those connections based on the data that they're seeing and the maps that they're seeing. So thank you for bringing up maps. And so the question again was, how do you educate the public about the various inequalities communities face in your field of work?
And I'll take or make some comments on that next. I think the easiest, most relatable, tangible difference is really related to heat. If you just focus on that, and if you look at different factors that create neighborhoods or communities, and think about managing life in an unbearable heat wave with communities that are denser, lack shade, that are more built up, that have an inferior housing stock, that think about not having access to a car where you can hop in on a really hot day and crank up the air conditioner, but think about having to walk to the bus or to transit and not having a safe tree-lined street to get there, or a bus shelter. I mean, there's a sidewalk inventory, which is totally fascinating, that CMAP did for the region, that just says, how do you get to where you're going if you don't have access to a vehicle? And I think that's one way to drive it home, because you can think about global inequalities and the communities that will be hurt first and worst by climate change impacts, but thinking very close to home. Think about somebody with an old house that they're not, or a multifamily living in an apartment where they don't have access just to control their own temperature, or something called energy burden, which looks at the proportion of a household income that is spent on energy. And the higher that proportion is, the greater the energy burden. And then how do you get past investing in energy efficiency to try to bring that down if you don't have a lot of disposable income, or if your housing is just not capable of adapting to heat extremes?
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And even if you don't, I'm just thinking of from an educator, like a practice, even if you may not have time to check out the sidewalk inventory, but just using Google Maps and zooming out and looking at the green space or lack of green space within your school community, maybe the neighborhoods that the students represent. But yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And Eric, how do you educate the public on this topic?
Sure. I'm going to say, I'm probably have the least to say about this compared to the other panelists. So, but the one thing I will point to is, for example, West Nile virus, which is this mosquito-borne virus. We think of mosquitoes as something out in the country, but West Nile virus is an urban disease where we get lots of cases in urban areas. And the reason being that stormwater infrastructure in these highly pavemented, concreted areas, very little pervious surface, are good breeding grounds for the kind of mosquitoes that can spread West Nile virus. And so the same questions we have of how we're going to deal with increased precipitation, and more flash flooding potentially in these same neighborhoods is going to also potentially impact, their risk of disease from these mosquitoes. And so the more we can, think creatively about ways to hold that water when you need to, but let it go away and not get stored in pools that the mosquitoes can breed in, the more we can avoid exacerbating those, compounding problems that Edith and Elaine have been talking about. So. And
this makes me think about like trash or just like tires. Like I'm thinking of just like stuff that tends to house a lot of these puddles, and like why cleanups are necessary. Yeah, like what's contributing to those breeding grounds. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. And then how about you, Trent?
Yeah, this is a really tough one, because I think Elena mentioned this, that maps are really good for building awareness that there is a problem. If you live in the neighborhoods that are affected, the maps just kind of tell you what you already know. So it's not really something that it's really more highlighting information for people who are making decisions to say, look, this is a big issue. And here in Champaign, it's almost I mean it's really I don't know, in a bad way, poetic, that you cross over literally train tracks and you go from a census tract that's in the top 5% of heat vulnerability in the whole country, to cross over the train tracks to go to one that's in the bottom 10% of heat vulnerability. Now heat waves don't manifest themselves differently in the 10 feet to go over the train tracks. It's a built-in social vulnerability to that. And so again, just showing people who are making decisions that this is something that exists, this is manifests, can be powerful, but it really comes down to that actually inspiring the decision making and the policy to actually fix those social vulnerabilities. And that's really the biggest challenge, because those neighborhoods that are most vulnerable are also the least affluent typically, which means they're a lot of times the least politically affluent, politically connected. So that's really a big problem. So plugging away with those maps is really important. But I would also say that for educators, it's really important not to just point out that there is disparate vulnerability, but why there's disparate vulnerability. And so, like Elena kind of mentioned, I mean, if you overlay the neighborhoods in Chicago that were redlined in the 1920s and 30s, they line up perfectly with these vulnerabilities. So, if, for example, if you're a history teacher, and climate change may or may not seem relevant for what you're thinking, the climate, the disparities and the impacts of climate justice directly align with the history of our development, and not just in Chicago, in almost every city in the U.S. So teaching students how, not just how climate change manifests in the hazards, but also in the vulnerability and the history and the sociology and the political science, every single the creative writing that is that every single subject in school can kind of come together for that as a relevant aspect to that. I think that's really important because, I'll say this for the optimism, like what gives us hope, but for young folks coming into this problem, understanding why the problem exists is already well above, what average people are really aware of. So I think that's really important too. It's really where educators play an important role.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the students in my class, if they're concerned about climate change, they want to engage in this work. How can young people engage in this work? So, and this is open for anyone.
I'll take that one right away too, with a good resource and invitation. At the local government level, it is certainly possible, particularly for those who are educating high school students or older. But the municipalities have citizen commissions. These are voluntary commissions that are that provide advice to their local government. This is particularly true in the suburbs, and they can be very open. I have presented, and I inventoried a few years ago, I found some 80 citizen commissions focused on sustainability in the suburban region. I would say that there are also some communities with even youth commissions, that these are, and I've been to commission meetings where there's a student representative present, and they're respected, valued members. You have direct access to influencing decision makers at the local level. So that's one thing that I would highly recommend. And if your community doesn't have a citizen commission, show up at City Hall on the night, or village board. Even for tiny communities, there's always public comment. And you've got 3 minutes to speak. You might need to register in advance and make a statement. Say you care about this, and this is a level of accessibility that you don't get with the federal government or the state government. So.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I actually wrote that down, and I believe one of my students is part of a youth commission based on recent conversations. I'm going to circle back with my student next week and see, because he was excited sharing his direct interaction about issues in his community. So thank you for that. Elena, go ahead. What can students do if they're interested?
Yeah, because there's been such a huge student movement across the world inspired by Greta, right? I think she's definitely made opportunities available. And I'm gonna bring it back to, thinking locally within your school. Because I think like that is definitely, if there isn't an environmental group, I know it's not too hard to establish school groups. I think you just need like a teacher to sponsor it. A lot of schools do have it. I was asked to be a speaker at Northside College Prep that was organized by the student group. And so, I think there are a number of things that you can do, low-hanging fruit, big picture within your school community. You could try to even organize composting. It's not the easiest thing, but that could be like a big goal for a school. Even thinking about transit, if the school is able to transition to energy efficient light bulbs, thinking about some of these kind of school environment, like that's your community level, can be very achievable. And then maybe expanding outside of your school when you have some of those kind of low-hanging fruit to inspire. I always, kind of going back to the hope, when after I give talks, that question comes up. And then also, why should we do anything about it, since all like the corporation should be to blame? And I'll often say, individuals can feel empowered. You can feel like you're part of a solution, even when you're doing individually based activities. And that can then grow and expand. And it's important, right? You are contributing. So I think like thinking about your school is one of the best activities that students can do.
I completely agree with this. Thank you for sharing that. And then Trent, go ahead.
I'm not, I need to speak up first because I need to stop following Edith and Elena to take all my talking points. I'll claim that they're my talking points. The only thing I'm going to add is not just at your school, but at your home. Talk about it with your parents, challenge your parents. What are they doing about it? If you're something you're worried about, that same Yale survey, I kind of posted on there, 72% of those polled believe global warming should be taught in schools, and yet only 35% have reported to have talk about it occasionally, even occasionally, 35% of the people. And again, it just doesn't come up. So talking about it with your friends, with your family, along with all of these other things that are mentioned is really important to just bringing it up and making sure that folks know that you're concerned about it. And then the other thing I was going to mention is not, and this kind of hit on the mental health aspect too, not to despair. I think Elena's point is really important, that, any individual action. I have met students who do creative writing, who write poetry, who blog about an EV, and that's their action, and that's what they like to do. That's positive in the sense of it helps, if nothing else, it helps folks think take their action in their way that they feel is what they want to do, which is a really positive thing. And it can really help kind of get rid of those negative emotions of despair that can come along with climate change, especially for young folks.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for reinforcing that. So important. And Eric, what would you encourage young people to do if they're interested?
Yeah, I want to definitely echo what Trent said. Various studies have found that a lot of times when people do shift their thinking on these kinds of issues, it's because of their interactions with their children or grandchildren, and not with somebody they're arguing with on the internet, and that kind of thing. And so in a sense, we think about how, we're in the United States, we have a really big per capita carbon footprint. And I really like what climate scientist Catherine Hayhoe calls the climate shadow, which is your net effect of all of your actions on the situation, which includes who you talk to and how you talk to them and how you use your voice. And so, because we have a bigger climate footprint, that means we have our actions can make more change, and children, although they feel powerless, we know from research that actually they're not, that they can be nuclei of change. And so that would be my message to them, is that, using your voice has more power than you might guess.
And I also, thank you for sharing that. I also want to honor the questions that may have popped up in chat, but before we switch over to checking what's in the chat, most important question, and this is what Trent kept reinforcing throughout this talk too, is on the topic of mental health, how do you guys stay positive? So maybe you guys about a minute each to share through this field, being in this field of work, what's keeping you positive and hopeful? How are you engaging in that?
I guess I'll start off and just sort of say that as a biologist, I see that life is adaptable and humans are incredibly adaptable, and that as Trent indicated, this is not going to kill life on Earth, and it's not going to be the end of humanity. It's going to be a severe challenge, and a lot of people are going to be affected. Innocent people who are affected who should not be, but there's lots of ways that we are going to come out of this, hopefully in a much better place than we are now. So that's my very brief bit.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Trent, go ahead.
Yeah, two things. One is just the level of the healthy concern that and willingness to do something about it that younger folks have. Not just willing and do something about it can, as Edith kind of mentioned, push their public officials. So with generational change, I think will come a shift in a natural shift in the change of how concerned we are with climate change, and then of course a shift in public policy globally. Now, how fast that happens may not be as quick as maybe we need, but that is one good thing that I've seen, one source of optimism. And then another is just working with professionals outside of climate science that have taken up the charge of doing the hard work of implementing solutions or coming up with solutions. I technically have an easy job. I just point out all the problems and then go away and let people like Elena and Edith and Eric kind of figure out how the chips need to fall with that. So that all the great people really give me optimism of for the future of the fact that we can do this.
And I like that reinforcement that everyone is this puzzle piece in this larger puzzle. And so each person's role is so important for the next person. Elena, yeah, how do you stay positive in this field of work?
I channel previous movements that have struggled, and succeeded and still working and succeeding. And I think of the suffrage movement, and I think of the civil rights movement. And I think of ACT UP, the HIV/AIDS movement, where people were literally dying before, And so I think of those movements and how strong and powerful they were in achieving their successes, and when there were struggles, and how they then bumped up to kind of like 2 steps down, 1 step up, and they made achievements. And I think it's important to think about that from like a historical perspective, where this fits in and how we will get there. It can be a struggle, but we'll get there.
Thank you for sharing that. And Edith, how do you stay positive in this field of work?
I am really encouraged in the 5 years that I've been really pressing climate action to see how much support we're getting. Unlike Trent and the educators who get to work with young, hopeful people, I work with a lot of crabby old elected officials. I really do. A lot of them are retired. And I'll just say the willingness of these agencies to nimbly shift and take policy actions that make a difference. And there's so many examples of the communities that I work with, these crabby old municipal officials making meaningful climate action. And just one example, there was a program, it wasn't my program, but we participated in it, that looked at driving solar development. And that's a really important thing to do, is clean source of energy, really, really important. The program focused specifically on local government action to drive solar investment and to support it. And one of the villages that it was really boring, day-to-day routine stuff, streamlined permitting processes so that when someone comes into Village Hall and wants to put solar panels on, they have an easier time with it. They educated their building officials to make it go faster, and they earned designation for doing so. In the 3 years, they've seen a 26,000% increase in solar investment, solar permits in their communities. And it's that now trying to do something similar for electrification of transportation. I have a waiting list for communities that want to be EV ready. So I am encouraged that we can take action that is meaningful, and it's happening.
And I was strategic to ask you last because I could just assume in the space that you're in, all the work that you're doing to push folks who might be very set in their ways of just looking at certain topics. But this gives me hope to hearing that folks are slowly opening, and I like up to this concept of like, we need this change. And I think these panels are so powerful because we don't have a lot of spaces in community for us to like listen into experts and ask each other questions and push each other in ways that we need to be pushing each other. So thank you all so much for your time. I just want to be mindful of time because we only have about 3 minutes left. I went through the chat. I did not see an immediate question, but if folks do have a question for any of the panelists, I'll ask the panelists to just drop their email in chat if folks want to follow up. If not, I think Abby might be sending an email out too. So, and I think this was it within chat.
Yeah, so we did record this panel today, and we'll be sharing that out on YouTube and on the EEI webpage. And there was an intense amount of amazing resources shared in the chat. So as soon as we're done, I'm going to go through and copy those and create a little, shared resources list that I can send out to everyone that was participating today. And I will share that. I'll post that on our website as well, because I don't want all those great things to be lost. So we will definitely share that out.
Yeah, such an honor to have this many people here on this panel. And as an educator who teaches this, it gives me hope. It gives me these experiences to bring back to the classroom. It humanizes the content that we're teaching. It's easy to look at content, but once you start seeing faces and stories, it makes it a lot more powerful and the students feel it too. So I hope anyone who's on the session today ends up taking those notes and then finding a way to reconnect and thank the panelists here too for their time. So yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, everyone here, and Abby.
Yeah, thank you so much, Aisha. Again, panelists, we cannot thank you enough for your time and helping to bring this information to educators. And for everyone that was listening in this evening, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. And yeah, we hope we can stay connected and continue to learn from each other. Thanks, everybody. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks
Bye.
all.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
Thank